Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Half a century ago, the United States won the space race when it landed 2 men on the moon. That achievement gave the United States decades of political and economic dominance globally. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
On Sunday, the US launched a secret space plane, and last year, India launched its second lunar mission. Even New Zealand has a space agency. It looks like a second space race has begun. What's the difference between the first one and this space race?
Well, I think the first one, Bruce, was a much more of a binary affair between the United States and the Soviet Union, whereby the exploration of space became a key component of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union was an early front runner. It launched Sputnik in 1957, which shook the Americans. And then the Russians also had the first astronaut into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. In 1962, President Kennedy pledged to send human beings to the moon, and he didn't live to see it, but it was achieved in 1969 with the Americans being the first and so far the last human beings to make it to the moon. So in a sense that ended in an American victory. They got to the moon first, but they terminated their last visit to the manned mission to the moon was 1972. So the big difference, I think, with the new space race, there was a bit of a, we have to get this in some sort of context. NASA and other space agencies have continued to use unmanned space missions and reconnaissance. Some of these have been spectacularly successful. But what we've noticed in the 21st century, particularly, I think, in the last few years, is that a number of nations are now entering the fray in space exploration. India, China. China recently became the first country to explore the dark side of the moon, that part of the moon that's always facing, is never facing the sun, I ought to say. And they sent a robot craft there that landed. So we're also seeing plans by NASA now to have another manned mission to the moon in 2024, and one has also been announced by NASA for Mars, the first, by 2030. Meanwhile, as we mentioned, China, India, Japan. So we got more and more states getting involved in space exploration. At the same time, and this is a key difference from the earlier period, this is no longer just government driven. The private sector is getting involved in a big way. And as you mentioned in the introductory remarks, Bruce, Rocket Lab is now one of only 2 private companies in the world which is launching satellites. So in a sense, New Zealand has also become part and parcel of this process. And what I think it's very different in that sense. It's much more a decentralized exploration of space than occurred before. There will, of course, be collaboration, but also competition.
What prize is on offer to the winner of this space race?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I think diplomatic prestige. I think there is a fair degree of nationalism involved. Mr. Trump made his intentions clear when he launched what he called the US Space Force in December 2017. That he wanted America not only to remain preeminent, but to consolidate that preeminence in space. China, which is a new superpower, will want to have the sort of prestige and diplomatic influence that goes with that, and it sees exploration as a way to do that. And I think you could argue that India, which is also a rising power and has actually had some impressive achievements in space, will also be looking upon it as a way to project national influence. There is also, quite apart from prestige, there's also, from the private sector, it appears to be quite a lucrative business. It's expensive to get into, but once established, could have very rich returns. Rocket Lab and Elon Musk's SpaceX company stand to make a lot of money because they can actually fill in the gaps. I mean, governments they can't use an infinite supply of taxpayers' money, and companies like Rocket Lab and SpaceX, they see opportunities to deepen their role and make quite a lot of money in the process. And we also have to say that what's the other prizes? The focus at the moment seems to be on locations such as the Moon, Mars, and possibly asteroids. That is to say, all of these, in the case of the Moon, the Americans and perhaps the Chinese may be looking to establish a base on the Moon for exploration beyond, well, within the solar system and beyond. It obviously saves a lot of money if you can launch from the Moon and avoid some of the costs of escaping the Earth's atmosphere, which is very expensive. Mars has been signaled as well. Possible human settlements on Mars have been mooted, and I think that would be certainly under consideration. And asteroids, well, the other thing we haven't discussed, Bruce, is that a number of companies are seriously looking into mining in outer space. They'll be looking for resource extraction, perhaps on the Moon, perhaps on Mars, and certainly from asteroids. And so this is becoming more technically feasible as the 21st century unfolds, but it does, of course, raise concerns.
Is the space race all about up there? Does it have any impact on international affairs down here?
I think it does, Bruce. I think there's always been an under-recognized linkage between space exploration and what happens down here, the sort of international politics of the Earth. It's no coincidence that the foray into space in the 50s and the 60s was followed by a growing environmental movement. I think once human beings were able to see where they lived from the sterile, cold, uninhabitable environment of space, then they realized how precious their world, the Earth, is. So in other words, I think our perspectives of where we live has changed through exploring space, seeing it from the outside rather than seeing it from the inside out. So I think that is a significant factor. The key question, I think, though, whether the exploration of space will affect us on Earth is, of course, depends on whether you think it's going to intensify geopolitical competition on Earth or whether it's going to diminish it. At the moment, it looks like many commentators would argue that space exploration, the new space race, could intensify it, both commercially and in terms of state-to-state relations. However, I would argue that there are technical and financial restraints or constraints on how far a country or a company can unilaterally pursue its interests in outer space. So I think, despite themselves, states will have to collaborate if they're seriously interested in exploring space, because quite frankly, several countries pooling their resources can achieve much more than they can acting unilaterally. That applies to the United States, Russia, China, India, any other actors there. And I think that's something they're going to have to come to terms with. So the motivation may be nationalistic. The outcome may be more internationalism. The other thing is that we should take into account here, Bruce, we're talking a little bit about space exploration from very much a human point of view. We are just a speck in what's an infinite space. And actually, I was very interested in the comments of the head of science of NASA, Ellen Stofan, who said in 2015, within the next decade, we will discover life outside Earth. So, it's very interesting that the head of science at NASA says that it's almost certain, if it's not within the next decade, she said it will be within the next 2 decades after that we will discover life outside Earth. It suggests to me they already have picked up some indicators, but that will change our behavior in space, if, for example, we encounter other civilizations which may be much more older, much more advanced than ourselves, let's face it, if they can make it to our neighborhood, they are probably much more advanced. They're probably quite alarmed by what they see on Earth as well, I should imagine. But that will have an effect. The fact that we may realize we're not the only ones in the neighborhood may well affect our behavior both in space and indeed on Earth.
Thank you, Robert. Very interesting.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.